Welcome to the Commerce Tomorrow podcast. Your one stop to learn about the technology that's powering the future of commerce. Here are your hosts, Dirk and Kelly.
Welcome to another episode of the Commerce Tomorrow podcast. I'm joined by Joel Crabb, Vice President of Architecture for Target. I'm also joined by my co-host, Dirk Horrig. Welcome, Joel.
Morning. Nice to be on the podcast.
Before we get started, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you do at Target.
Sure. So my role at Target is VP of Architecture, and I'm also the Chief Architect of Target. And I have purview basically over how we build all the software that Target runs. And Target, being a very large retailer, has something north of around 3,000 applications that we build, manage, and run to do our business. And so there's just a lot of software being written. And my main role really has been to provide an architectural vision on how we build the software, and then it can all work together to achieve kind of speed to market, innovation, and obviously support our team members and guests while they do their job and they shop.
Joel, can you tell us a little bit more about your career arc?
Sure. So my background is engineering. So I started out as an electrical engineer, and my career goals when I was younger was to build fusion reactors. So I went to graduate school for nuclear fusion at the University of Wisconsin, and came out of that and decided that being a professor wasn't what I wanted to do. So my only marketable skill when I came out of school was software. And so I started basically writing software for medical device companies in the Twin Cities. And from there, I just kept building more software skills and eventually became a Java developer and moved into consulting and building large-scale business systems and eventually consumer-facing systems in Java, starting in the late 90s all the way through the mid-2000s. And at a point in my career, I decided that I really wanted to get into a role that actually provided more leadership to companies rather than just building projects, and moved in towards the management roles. And I would say at Best Buy is probably the place where I moved into, I was still the chief architect for BestBuy.com, but also took over all the software development for rewriting BestBuy.com. And that was in about 2011. And from 2011 to 2016, we rewrote BestBuy.com. My role was both head of digital engineering and the chief architect, and went through a lot of effort to basically take a monolithic system and turn it into a highly distributed, infinitely scaling, basically e-commerce system. The system that we built evolved and scaled as we built it to support very large increase in sales. And so from there, I came to Target as the chief architect for Target, and my role here is expanded in terms of that it covers the entire company now, as opposed to just the .com area really at Best Buy. And so spent most of my career writing software, so about 15 years just basically being a coder architect, and then the last 5 or 8 years or so basically being a chief architect and managing software development and architecture at large companies.
Yeah, no, that's great background. Clearly the skills of being a Java developer are very different from being an architect and then from being a manager itself.
Yes.
So what are the different skills that you've had to learn, and how have you made that transition personally?
So the skills that you need to be a manager are a lot different, obviously, than being an engineer. I think the big thing for me that I had to learn was really how to listen better to people and to take other opinions into account. I think when you grow up as a engineer / architect, you get into this mode where you really know best. And early in my career, I was certainly probably one of those guys that would come in and just say, let's just do it this way. And I expect everybody to just do it that way. It doesn't work so well when you're a manager to just kind of wander around and say, do it this way. I mean, people sometimes try to, but they don't really understand. Yeah. So much better to start to learn how to actually delegate, get your teams to come up with the solutions themselves. Sometimes it's what you were thinking of, sometimes it wasn't. But if everyone's bought into a solution, you're going to get a better result than if you're just running around trying to dictate ways to do things. So really, I think for me, the listening and delegation and management skills were the biggest things I've had to learn in the last 5 years.
I believe there was a lot to learn. What I would like to dive in a little bit deeper is about the organizational setup that you're currently managing. Can you tell us a little bit more about the setup of the development organization? For example, how many developers are there? How's the organizational setup? How do you run it? Can you share any insights with us?
Sure. So Target is about... IT is about 4,000 people, and about 3,000 of those are engineers. What we're trying to do within Target is really create an engineering organization and an engineering culture. The teams are then set up as Agile/DevOps teams. So it's small teams that are owners of their product, and they have they correspond to product managers across the business. So we've put in place a product management organization and an engineering culture that thrives on basically giving the engineers the problems to be solved and letting them go figure out how to solve it. And so if you're running, basically I think we have about 300 or so when you get down to it, actual engineering teams, as they're all working basically independently, but towards that whole of providing all the capabilities and services that a retailer needs to run its business.
And how do you promote like a culture of innovation, right? So clearly you can't continue to release software once a month or once a quarter, right? And many large retailers are kind of stuck in that cycle. So besides splitting into vertical teams, which by itself facilitates faster releases to production, how have you implemented organizational change or any policies or procedures? Or, have you done anything to make it clear that iteration is something that Target values as a company?
Yeah, so I think when we have a CIO that joined Target in about 3 years ago, Mike McNamara, and he brought with him that we are going to build a technology innovation culture at Target. We need to do this basically to compete in the marketplace today. And so the teams were changed to basically give them that empowerment to go do, build the things they need to build. And part of that is to start to deliver a lot faster. So, I don't think I'm pretty sure there's probably not any teams left at Target that deliver on a quarterly basis anymore. Like everybody is delivering on possibly a daily, probably more likely a weekly or bi-weekly cadence. All of them are keeping their own cadences in terms of when they deliver to production. So all the teams basically are planning their own production deliveries and doing it at the cadences that work for them. And so across the company, I think we're pretty good at continuous integration and testing and being able to actually deliver code to production. And we're moving, many of the places are moving towards that continuous delivery model where we can basically deploy anytime we feel like it.
That's great achievement, and being now that agile and that fast, of course, often it comes with failure. At least it's part of the game. You need to deal with that. Can you share how you deal with that within the company? So is it seen more negatively or positively? So as you release often and fast, it's something that you need to face, I admit.
Yeah, so when you release often and quickly, I would say actually there's less risk of failure in general, in my opinion, in releasing often and more quickly. But, things do fail and things do break and we do have problems. And but the general attitude here is if you broke it, just go fix it and fix it quickly. And we're moving more towards that. We'll put it in production. If it didn't work exactly how we'd like, we'd rather fix it as fast as we can. And if we can't do that, then we'll kind of go back to that standard, okay, let's roll everything back. We really try to avoid doing that as much as possible. So the teams are allowed to go take risks. We've built plenty of, I would say, ideas and projects that we've allowed to be built that, in the end, they didn't go anywhere. But a lot of it's being pulled up from the engineering organization. They have the ability to take some of their time and go work on projects that they think are good for Target and also interesting to them. So if you kind of look, we've open sourced quite a few different projects over the years, in the last couple of years. And we also allow engineers, they can go work on open source projects pretty much in any area. So we contribute to things. We actually contribute to Facebook's open source. We have open source projects, many open source projects around Kubernetes. And we have a whole office that's dedicated to facilitating Target engineers releasing and working in the open source community.
Okay. So, there's a central tension between microservices and the goals of developers versus the corporation itself. So, it wasn't too long ago that enterprises bought software from big vendors through multi-year license agreements, and the company would standardize on database X or infrastructure Y. And for that era, it made perfect sense, right? If you had centralized IT. But now with all these vertical teams you have, things are decentralized to some degree, right? So each team should, in theory at least, have some control over the technology that they use. So how do you balance the needs of the enterprise standardization, procurement, standard things that an enterprise needs versus the needs of each team to have some autonomy and some control and freedom to pick the best tech that works for them?
Yeah, so you're getting into the actual work of the architecture team then. So Target does have standards, and we do expect people to follow them. The standards are actually kept in GitHub. So the way it's structured is really any engineer can go submit a pull request to request that, hey, Target should be using this new technology. And from that, it will generate, a discussion amongst the engineers of Target and also moderated by the architecture team. And generally, we like to go make people prove that the technology works before we're going to say, hey, we adopted it all. So when that first pull request comes in, it's usually the answer is, okay, go show us what you're doing with that technology. And so that's a path for technology to come into Target. But we also have the ability to let me back up a second. Well, what we do is we do have that set of standards that people are supposed to use. And there's a difference between software that basically is expensive to procure and to deploy, and software that is pretty inexpensive to procure, use, and deploy. And so things like databases are expensive. So we have a limited number of databases that you can use, relational databases and NoSQL databases, and databases that you can use in the various cloud providers. So we'd like people to use those. But then there's, if you're trying to pick a new open source project that is really just a jar that goes into your application, there's not a lot of constraints on that. People are using all different types of open source, and as long as there's not a large cost to either deploy it or to procure it, then it's kind of, you can use whatever you want. And so our developers use 5 or 10 different IDEs. It's really up to them. Some teams are using Hollow for caching, others are using memcached. It's kind of up to them to use those types of things. But if you're going to try and pick, a Unix operating system, a database, we're going to say these are the ones we want to use. So
makes
cloud
sense.
Providers, cloud providers, same thing. We're going to,
it's like a menu basically.
Yeah, we picked a cloud provider. You need to use this one.
Yeah.
But you want them to use a new piece of open source. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
That's great. I got a question. So with now such an agile and fast-moving development organization, and you already told us that you have a lot of developers. I just can imagine that there are a lot of initiatives and stuff that's going on and that you plan. So how do you in general roadmap? And how do you get actually everything out there? How does it work?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're implementing at Target is what I call the Target Retail Platform. So we have an overarching roadmap for how we're going to build out all the aspects that a retailer needs in conjunction with a platform approach itself. So we have what I call the platform surface roadmap, and that basically is saying, what are all the APIs that I need to run a retailer? What's all the data that I need to run a retailer? And what sort of pre-joined aggregated data do I need to run all my systems? And so we have a high-level roadmap of how we're going to build all these different pieces. And there's a lot of teams that are basically dedicated to building pieces of a platform. And then you have your other types of roadmaps is maybe what you're thinking about, which is more initiatives that Target wants to implement across all the different teams that we have here to achieve kind of, a much larger thing than you can achieve in one team. And those, I think in any company, that prioritization of these types of initiatives is always hard. But what we expect is that our product managers will go work together to, maybe achieve something larger. Something like Drive Up is a good example of something that we did last year, where you can order and have it delivered directly to your car when you show up. And that takes an integration across, the digital team, the mobile team, and the stores team to make something like that happen. So the product managers and the product management, executives are really tasked with ensuring that they coordinate across all the development teams.
One more question about organization, and then we'll get into technology. So a common problem that folks have is and you've faced this, I'm sure, and Dirk and I have as well. You can only get so high in an organization on an individual contributor track. Right? You can be the best Java developer in the world. You could be James Gosling, right? But you're still not going to be higher than maybe director level in the corporate structure. So how do you incentivize people who are really good and really happy doing what they're doing in their current role to stay as individual contributors versus going to a management position which they may or may not excel at?
Yeah, so that question of always, can I achieve the level in a company I want as an individual contributor comes up all the time. At Target, we've actually got two tracks. We have the management track and the individual contributor track. And the individual contributor track right now goes up to senior director level. So we've got it extended to that point already. And so from the engineer standpoint, we go from basically hiring directly out of college and internships, and they have that path that they can get all the way to senior director basically in that individual path. So the path is already there for people, and really it's around I think when people want to stay as individual contributors, it's really for us is, can we provide them with interesting work? And Target just has so much going on that any engineer that excels at their role, we can always find interesting work, right? A lot of engineers like to work on new things, but those projects only last for so long. So we want to make sure that we have the ability to both move the engineers around when they want to, and in some ways let them find their own path. So we have a number of projects going on where the engineers more or less volunteered on their free time, and then it eventually evolved into a project, and then the project got its own funding, and then these engineers that once were working on something in their free time are now working on it full time. And being able to do stuff like that will keep the engineers engaged, so that they have that ability to get all the way to a senior director level within the company.
Yeah, and that's a pretty reasonable level, I think. Hard to go much higher than that. That's good to hear. A lot of organizations just don't value individual contributor tracks very much. So
yeah, no, I think Target and myself is I want good engineers to write code, right? That's right. I think where in many ways they're most valuable. but you also need good engineers that can learn to manage people too. So it is a trade-off, and given the, kind of the tightness in the market in general, sometimes, hey, if you want to retain that great engineer and they want to be a manager, well, then we have that path as well.
Yeah.
We've got lots of people that have been moving towards that path in the last 2 years.
Yeah, it makes sense.
You always need both, but it's important that at first people have fun and that they are good at what they are working, right? So
right.
That's what's motivating everybody. So as we all three, Joel, Kelly, and I have something in common. In our past careers, we all had been Java developers.
Okay.
I would say we talk a little bit about technology. Joel, what are some of the new technologies that you are excited about? So is there any initiatives that you're currently investing in, stuff that you try to drive forward at Target? Anything you can share?
Sure. I think some of the more interesting things that are happening at Target are probably around in the video realm. So video analytics is a big thing that we're looking into. And on top of that, we're also working on some projects around augmented reality, trying to give customers basically, or our team members, the ability to use, their phone to look at a shelf full of goods and pull information out and present it back to them inside of a video stream. And once you start thinking about what you can do with that, like the options are kind of almost infinite. Every time we actually go do a presentation around this topic of augmented reality, the questions are always just about, hey, did you think that about, showing whether something's gluten-free or vegetarian or nut-free or something like that, as opposed to like, how does the technology work, which is actually pretty interesting because the technology is hard and there's a lot of stuff going on there trying to, process video frames inside of a store.
I can imagine that's hard.
Yeah. And so, but it's just funny because like even the engineers start asking questions about like all the things you could do with it as opposed to like how the technology works. I've seen that like 3 or 4 times now. So those are all interesting things. I try and stay away from talking too much about AI and machine learning just because everybody's talking about it, but we are, investing heavily in that, and we think it's something that can help us solve all sorts of problems, and we have plenty of examples of inside of Target where we are solving those problems. And then what everybody's favorite topic, of course, is distributed ledgers or blockchains.
No buzzword bingo is complete without blockchain.
Yeah, so I'd be remiss, in 2018 if I didn't at least say that. And that Target is, we're doing a couple of things in conjunction with our vendors, which aren't public yet, so I can't talk about them. But there's a couple. I got a couple of initiatives going on with our vendors, and then we're also. We had a whole blockchain hackathon here about 6 or 8 months ago, where we had 15 different teams just working on some sort of blockchain thing that they could think of for Target. And you could think of a million of them, right? Like Target coins or gift cards or anything having to do with supply chain and whatnot. But those are all the things that are all pretty much well known out there. But we are. I just want to make sure everyone understands Target is looking at these things. So, that's kind of I think that's like a high level run through of a lot of the newer technologies that are out there that we're also trying to incorporate inside of actual applications in Target.
Yeah. And, I think the key to your success has been your wholehearted embrace of microservices, whether that was here at Target or Best Buy.
They didn't call them microservices
No.
7 or 8 years ago when we were doing it at Best Buy.
Yeah. Same concept though, right? Small vertical teams. So, everybody seems to have their own unique flavor of what they consider microservices, right? So what are some of the key principles that you see for success? And also, when should people not touch microservices?
Yeah. As an architect and someone who is pushing service-oriented distributed architectures, it's 5 or 8 years ago, I actually I probably have maybe not the most healthy view of microservices. To me, it's an extension of a service-oriented architecture, and it's really an implementation style. And trying to get very granular, like people can get very, I think people can get very dogmatic about it. Like I got the question last week at one of the things I was presenting at, which is if it doesn't have its own dedicated data store, is it still a microservice? It's like, if we want to, try and go find, if it's possible to go find a textbook definition of a microservice, it probably says it has its own dedicated data store. Fine. Mm-hmm. But, when I've got 1,000+ services that I need to build, I'm not going to get too picky about it. What I'm really more interested is in, can you present the API that everyone else can use? How you implement it underneath the system. You can be very dogmatic about it and say, I have to have a different data store for every microservice that I build. Or, I'm going to have a set of APIs and there's going to be an underlying data store and they're going to share it. And I know that there's coupling and whatnot. But you know what? I'd much rather get to that API surface first and then let you go fix everything else underneath it. But for us, it's really about providing the data and services at scale to as many applications that want to use it at Target. So, so I may not be the best person to talk to microservices about because I'm more than willing to flex all over the place on it. But I think when you're working at a large company, you kind of have to be able to do those things.
Yeah, and no, you're actually the best person because I think a lot of people who are pontificating on Twitter or various blogs about microservices, they don't have that real world experience, right? Because it's not possible just to follow the textbook every time.
Right. Well, if you have a legacy, it's not possible at all.
Right. Or, there's these small 10-person companies in Silicon Valley. And that's, again, not a very pragmatic example where microservices even necessarily make sense, right? Because it's a fairly small team and limited surface area. But, at the Targets and Best Buys of the world, that's, I think, where it makes a lot more sense, and you've got to really be pragmatic. So that's a good, healthy viewpoint, I think. And I think,
all right,
as a general statement, tech should be more pragmatic rather than dogmatic about these kind of things.
I agree with you there. I've been most of the times accused of being way too pragmatic, and as an architect, architects aren't supposed to be pragmatic. Supposed to be lofty, right? But,
your ivory tower.
Yeah, you're supposed to be in your ivory tower.
As you already mentioned APIs a few times, can you share with us how you embraced APIs? So, for example, are all the front ends at Target fully decoupled? Is an API everywhere available? How have you done it?
Yeah, so if I get back to thinking about how we've defined what we call our Target platform, it's basically an API first architecture, and what we're doing is we're trying to separate things that are core to Target from things that are part of what we call the tenant space. So the tenant space you can think of as digital or a mobile application or a point of sale or something like that. And what we want to do is completely separate those UI or customer or interfaces to the team member or the business people from that underlying set of services. So we actually have a couple layers of APIs. When you start to look at this, we have an API layer that's really about those granular core services or those microservices. Those are probably the best definition of a microservice that we have. And a core service might basically provide you one thing, right? It provides you a price, it might provide you the item details, it might provide you a location, it might provide you sales information or whatnot. So we have that set of granular core data underneath that. On top of that layer of APIs is another set of APIs, which we call our process logic or aggregation layer. And that's basically things like we're going towards a world where we have one checkout system we call enterprise checkout. And enterprise checkout runs the checkout process on everything. So from your digital channel, mobile channel, and your store. And what it's providing is that standard set of business logic as an API that anybody needs to use to actually purchase something from Target. And so that availability to everyone speeds up our business if we want to start up a new business that needs to sell something. And then you go up one layer from that, and now I'm outside of the retail platform and I'm inside of a tenant. And a tenant may also have its own set of APIs around, data that's specific to the tenant or processes that are specific to that tenant. And then on top of that, you probably actually also have your view aggregation layer. We were talking about GraphQL earlier before we started the podcast, and we're actually putting in place a GraphQL at Target to basically separate those UIs from those underlying services yet at another layer. So, it's probably like 3 or 4, I think, layers of APIs going from the data all the way to the UI that's actually using that data or processes. And but we're being very specific at Target about if you're going to build an API, it's got to fit into one of these various components. It's either got to be core service, it's got to be an aggregation layer, it's got to be in a tenant. And where you are in the stack gives you either a lot of freedom. If I'm in a tenant, I can create APIs all day long, and I don't really care because you're just serving this one small part of the business. But if you're an API that's a core data service, you better put in an API that lasts, hopefully for years, so people don't have to change it.
So a different governance model based on the usage then.
Right. The governance model basically gets a lot tighter as you go down the stack and a lot looser as you go up it. And
same with how you procure technology. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. What we're trying to do with all these policies is allow innovation at the edges, as we call it. So in that tenant space where you are closest to your customer, you know best what's interesting and innovative. And we're trying to give you the ability to do that quickly and try stuff out and see what happens. And then, iterate, keep moving on from there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So if you take a look at like developers.target.com, you're clearly targeting third-party developers. You're giving them a big catalog of APIs. So what is the value of that for you as a business, right? Why go through all the work of documenting them and making them public?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a lot of partners that work with us, for one thing, and the interfaces that we like to use in interfacing with all of our partners is API-based and or event-based. So by having that catalog of APIs available and published, it's actually much more for the partners that we work with than really trying to seek out independent developers that are going to build something off of Target. And that's just kind of the strategy that we're on right now. So we have that, and it is available, and it's really largely for our integrations with outside companies.
Okay. So third-party integrations.
Yeah. And we're trying to get away from the file drops and FTPs and whatnot, and move towards API integrations and or event integrations.
Well, I can imagine you work with hundreds, if not thousands, of third parties. So having a single API layer probably makes a lot more sense.
Yep.
And point-to-points across the board. And then I have one final question, and I'll turn it over to Dirk. I know he has a couple, and then we can wrap it up. But so you talked a little bit about GraphQL. Where do you see that fitting into your future? I know you're adding a layer, but how strategic is it? Where's the value? Do you use a lot of React up front in the first place? Just love to hear your thoughts on that trend. It seems to have come out of nowhere in the past year.
Yeah, so GraphQL is pretty an interesting trend, but basically what it allows you to do is to not write a million aggregators. And one of the things that we were trying to figure out as we were going forward is we were creating literally hundreds of APIs, and these hundreds of APIs were really joining together 2 data sets, and they were being used by various tenants in the system and to drive their business. And we knew this was a problem, and we were trying to figure out how do you solve it? And GraphQL, you said, it kind of came out of nowhere in the last year or two. And we had some teams, the engineering teams, that were looking at it and realized that what we probably want to build is one layer of GraphQL that sits on top of most of our data sources, so that anyone from a tenant can basically then compose their, what data they need from GraphQL, rather than trying to call the 20 or 50 services they would have had to call, and figure out how to manage that call stack and manage that concurrency while they're trying to build this data set that they're going to use in some UI. And so we're actually in the process of putting this in place right now, which is to have this really kind of one layer of GraphQL that allows you to access virtually any set of data within Target. And obviously there's a lot of concerns about what that means. And there's to me there's a big concern about having teams. When you put in that one layer of separation, they're writing GraphQL queries now instead of calling services, and so they don't. I'm trying to decide whether not understanding the underlying data structures is okay or not okay, because people can start using data in very odd ways that maybe are very expensive to the underlying systems, and they just won't know because they won't see that. And so we're experimenting with it. We're actually putting quite a bit of effort into putting in this layer. But at this point, I would say we're still trying to determine like how it's going to be used, where it's going to be used, and just how much compute it's going to drive by the way people start to use it. So to your other question, yeah, we're using a lot of React here. We actually have what we call an internal UI toolkit. It's got a name. It's called Praxis, and it's actually got two forms. It's got an Angular form and a React form. And for our teams, we'd like them to basically take one of these two toolkits and basically use it as the generator or the underlying set of frameworks that they use to go off and build their UI systems. And we're trying to do that so we get some consistency across teams. Because if I got 3,000 applications, I'd like people from team A to be able to go to team B and not have to relearn a lot of UI components and frameworks. So we also have that light standardization across the UI, I would say, is probably the way to put that.
So as we're getting to the end of our episode, I have one last question. So with the modern architecture that you have built at Target.com, you said you have more than 3,000 applications. I can imagine that this requires a lot of flexibility on the infrastructure. How are you embracing public cloud?
Yeah, so we have 3,000 applications across all of Target, and right now we use Google's cloud. So last year was our first year actually running Target.com in Google's cloud, and worked pretty well for us. So clouds, I think, and public clouds are certainly part of our infrastructure going forward. Target also has, obviously owns their own data centers, and we have been putting in place a lot of internal cloud or a lot of internal infrastructure management for teams. So we're actually to the point where a team can basically go make a request to a system. If you're familiar with Spinnaker, it's really based on that. And have their application deployed for them into Target's, I'm going to just call it internal cloud space, which is, infrastructure we've made available to teams internal to Target. And I'm shying away from calling it a cloud because it's not really a cloud anymore. It's really it's really kind of getting back towards managed infrastructure just through a really nice UI. And so that's the direction we're going for most of our applications, because, most of our applications don't actually need to be that elastic or to kind of have that infinite scalability available to them. And so the vast majority of our applications can run on our internal cloud or managed infrastructure. So we're going down both paths really at the same time, and we're trying to use the ones that make sense for the applications themselves. So, if you're a digital application, you're probably deployed in a cloud. If you're a guest-facing application, you're probably deployed in a cloud, and I mean a public cloud for both those. If I'm an internal business-facing application, I'm probably deployed in my data center. And, just trying to make the best decisions for how the applications are actually used is the direction that we're going.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Yeah, unfortunately, we're already getting to the end of this episode. Thank you so much, Joel, for all the insights that you have shared with us and with everybody that's listening in. It's just impressive what you achieved at Target and everybody there, especially at that large scale. So not many have done that. So thanks for all the insights. Thanks, Kelly, for hosting that episode together with me, and thanks to everybody for listening. Everybody, great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. Thanks, Kelly, for having me on.